From George Square we walk down Delrmle Street and will turn left along West Stewart Street. Currently being built on the corner is Bonar's Kirk, St Andrews. Bonar's congregation followed him from the Mid-Kirk when he wasn't nominated for the position there. Along here are a better class of houses, including that of Robert Ewing on the right and my friend Mr Ritchie on the left. Robert Ewing is one of the older generation of merchants in Greenock. He has run the town for a while, but changes in the form of the Bains and others came along. He was involved in the mahogany trade and the fishing business, as well as many other interests. His father, Humphrey, owned plantations in Jamaica, and I believe his cousin is James Ewing, Provost of Glasgow, West India merchant, banker, who married Jane Crawford of Port Glasgow. It was he who founded the West India Association, which lobbies against the slave emancipation. He was a plantation owner in Jamaica, and he has just built Castle House in Dunoon as his retirement home. Jane Miller, wife of Robert Ewing and daughter of my old boss, died in Greenock on the 24th of October 1825. On the left, just at Jamaica Street, is where Walter Ritchie had his house, called Belmont. He was one of our most successful merchants. He traded all around the world and even sent a few ships to the Guinea coast for slaves to trade to the West Indies. He was a partner with my dear late brother Thomas, who died in Honduras in the mahogany trade. Walter Ritchie moved to London, and the house is now owned by James Grieve of the Newfoundland trade. I remember the furore when Ritchie's business partner James Gamble and he had a falling out. Ritchie went out to Garville House to talk to him and ended up being charged for assault. The argument came to blows. In 1811 he was appointed as a local delegate to represent the interests of the planters and West India merchants against the perceived disinterest of the government. The chairman was George Robertson and the secretary John Dunlop. These men are the ideal ones to talk to about slavery and the current arguments raging about emancipation. I wrote in Blackwood magazine recently, "It is not for a moment to be supposed that there is a British subject, far less a British minister, that will or would defend the preservation of slavery for its mere commercial advantages. The planters, who alone are interested in its continuation at all, are much misrepresented when it is supposed that they desire the continuance of slavery for its own sake. There may have been a time when it was supposed that slave labour was the only labour adapted to the climate and work of the West Indies, and when the necessity of slavery was defended in that plea, but such is no longer the case. Juster notions now prevail, and the question, instead of being discussed with respect either to climate or labour, is considered upon a more benevolent principle. We are no longer afflicted with the defences of slavery for its own sake, and the commercial benefits arising from it. The principle and right of all mankind to universal freedom is frankly admitted. The only cause of withholding emancipation from the slaves now rests entirely upon the means for supporting them, and preventing them from falling into those evils which visit with so many severities the lot of the labourer in Europe. The point to be determined is no longer the right of the slave to be equal in privileges with his master, for that is admitted, but to ascertain that while we dissolve the existing ties between them, we do not place the master or the slave in a worse situation than that in which he stands at present. I have an extract of a letter from Mr. James Grossard, master of the ship Harmony from Honduras, dated off Dover, October 1822. He lives on Jamaica Street, just a few minutes from here. We sailed from Belize on the 22nd of August, and were boarded off the Coloradas by a pirate brig and schooner, which took away a puncheon of water, a saw, and a spyglass. Between the Havana and Matanza, we were boarded by a schooner with about 40 men, who plundered us of 2 gun carriages partly made, 3 boxes of silver, a bag containing $450, 37 cirons of indigo, 17 doubloons, and other articles. They then put a rope around my neck to hang me, and gave me 2 or 3 squeezes, as I had told them there was no silver on board. They afterwards beat the crew, took away all their clothes as well as mine, and threw overboard part of our sarsaparilla and logwood. There was a slave revolt in Barbados in 1816, and one of the leaders was Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin, the illegitimate son of Joseph Franklin, whose wife Dorothy was the sister of Arthur Ochterton's wife Anne. In the investigation afterwards, Joseph Gibson replied to a question. I was manager of Padmore's plantation, the property of Arthur Ochterton, in the parish of St. Philip at the time of the insurrection of the slaves on the 14th of April 1816. I had been living as chief overseer on the said plantation for 14 years. The slaves were in most respects as comfortably situated and in general as healthy as most on the island. They had not only as much food as was fully sufficient to sustain their health and strength, but very often could spare some to sell. It consisted of grain and roots of different sorts, molasses and rum in proportion to their labour, with salt and salted codfish or other salt provisions. For clothing, they had penistone, osnaburgs, checks, caps and handkerchiefs. The period during which they were kept at work, I consider, never exceeded 9 hours and 12, and I was in the frequent habit of giving them a day or a half day. They had as good and warm houses as the negroes on most estates, and when sick were sent to the hospital, where the plantation apothecary attended them with every care. When punishment was necessary, moderate chastisement or solitary confinement were the measures I adopted to that purpose, and I can assert without the fear of contradiction that I never practised unnecessary rigour or severity. Long before the insurrection, it appeared to me that the slaves were inclined to presume upon and to abuse the great indulgences granted them by proprietors and overseers, such as permitting them to have dances frequently on Saturday and Sunday evenings, easing their labour by the use of every species of machinery which could have that effect, suffering them to become comparatively rich by rearing and selling poultry, sheep, goats, hogs, and their superfluous allowances of corn and roots, all of which induced them to assume airs of consequence, and to put a value on themselves unknown amongst the slaves of former periods. Their minds being, as I conceive, thus prepared for any act of insubordination, towards the end of the year, evil-disposed and designing persons got amongst them, and taught them to believe that the registry bill was an act of the government at home to set them free, that their freedom was, in contempt of the king's or prince regent's orders, withheld by them by their owners, and that therefore the only way to obtain it was by force of arms. These motives and causes, as far as I am able to judge, I think, led to the insurrection. Arthur Ochterton, the Barbados merchant, had his counting house in Jamaica Street. On his Brighton plantation he owned 60 slaves. His son, also Arthur, lives on Union Street. He married a daughter of George Robertson. Another brother, George, married Jane Ewing. His daughter Mary married William Leach, brother of Quinton Leach, our chief magistrate.
As we turn right down Patrick Street, we pass Captain William Martin's house on the opposite corner. He made his fortune sailing to the West Indies and is now retired, and devoted his life to religious causes, especially Sabbath observance. Beyond his house is Robertson's mansion. The Newfoundland merchant and banker, Adam Ferry, the sugar refiner, now lives there. The statistical account of 1792 stated there were 3,387 families in Greenock, of which he reckons 1,825 were Highland. Mostly they came from nearby Argyll. The most common surname in the town was Campbell. Most of the labourers, boatmen, sailors, etc. in Greenock are from the Highlands, and they often settle here with large families to support, which requires their utmost industry and application. Many, in fact, found working in the developing shipbuilding industry. Many girls and women were employed in domestic service. We see the kirk on the corner of Delrmle Street, Moran's Kirk or the North Kirk. It was built about 10 years ago to accommodate the increasing amount of Highlanders in this town. One may at times walk from one end of the town to the other without hearing a word of any language but Gaelic. It is also noted, of this, their native tongue, which is said to be copious and expressive, the Highlanders are amazingly fond. We are heading to the shore front at the foot of Patrick Street where the glebe lands are. The land here is owned by the old kirk and has been let out for exclusive homes as well as various forms of industry, including rope works and sugar houses. At the foot of Patrick Street was the outer wall of Messrs. Laird's rope work, which was often washed by the sea. This work afterwards passed into the possession of Messrs. Ramsay, and in their time complaints were made as to the state of the shorehead here, so that either they or the town had to make a footpath to keep pedestrians dry-shod, and to protect the wall from the wash of the sea. Eastwards of this wall stood the outer works of Fort Jervis, with 11 24-pounders. It is no longer used for its original purpose. Boys scale the escarpment and have fine sport in Old Jervis, sporting round the large cannon and through all the length and breadth of the fort. Latterly, all and sundry use the top of the grassy earthworks as a nice seat in fine weather, after the labours of the day were done, to witness the bathing and to hear, and no doubt discuss, the topics current in that stirring time of war. The back wall of the fort formed the north-east side of Laird's ropework, and on the south-west side stood Messrs. Laird's dwelling house, which is a very handsome erection. It, along with the ropework, became the property of and was occupied by Mr. Thomas Ramsay and family. The ropework extended in length from a little east of the Glebe Refining Company's store to the foot of Laird Street. On the south side it had an engine house and machinery for making patent rope, and many a day have I been engaged in boyish wonder looking at that machinery twisting up these large, smoothy, glossy strands for the manufacture of ship's cables, for these were the days of hempen cables and cordage, when rope spinning or making was emphatically a trade of note. The glebe was the name given to the lands owned by the West Kirk. The character of the glebe, the word itself signifies earth or soil, has changed, but the fewing is more remunerative than the fields of golden grain, and so the teens of the parish minister are quite secure. Teens, or the income, to the glebe, is the name given in Scotland to tithes. This area became the centre for one of the largest sugar houses, close as it was to the harbours, the Glebe Sugar House. Built in the last couple of years, it has gained a well-earned reputation for quality and technical advances. Before this, Mr. William Leach opened a refinery at Clarence Street in 1812, just along the way. His brother Quintin was chief magistrate and traded in mahogany from the West Indies. He was an expert in navigation at sea, using the latest technology in conjunction with Sir Thomas Brisbane. The Reverend Robert Steele, who was the inducted minister of the parish in 1792, was familiarly spoken of as the bishop, due to his kindly traits. He married a Miss Boyd, and in this we find the origin of the name Boyd Street. This area could be classified as quite affluent at one point. It is a bit away from the town centre, on the church's glebe lands and close to the shore. Residents here have included Mrs. Robert McPhee, Miss Shaw, Mrs. Buchanan, Miss Jean Caird, and a day boarding school run by a Miss Hughes, the sister of a Mrs. Jane Gomoshinsky. Lieutenant Joseph Gomoshinsky of the 1st Polish Lancers had arrived here as a refugee. He had fought in the Polish uprising of 1830. He is listed as a teacher of French and German and is noted as giving lectures on the history of Poland. There were 3 Hughes sisters living at Boyd Street. Gomoshinsky married Jane, the daughter of Thomas Hughes, a solicitor of Liverpool and St John's Episcopal. In 1840, the couple had their first child, Catherine Stanislaw Gomoshinsky. We move along to Kerr Street. Alan Kerr, the founder of the Seamen's Friends Society in 1820 and of the Ann Street School in 1829, has his house here. He was a man of singularly fine character, and alike in the town council and amongst the general public held in the highest esteem. It was written of him by the Reverend Herbert Story, an intimate friend, that he was a man of remarkable simplicity, mingled with considerable shrewdness and a great deal of sterling worth. A cripple and an invalid, but his mental powers were of the finest order. His chief delight, when his health allowed him, was in going about on his crutches doing good. Kerr Street perpetuates his good name. He was a jury member in the trial of the Paisley Radicals. He married Anne Dow, whose brother is a merchant in New Orleans. The Dow brothers, Stuart, William and John, were born in Greenock and were merchants in West India and North America. They held letters of marque in the fight against America and were in business with Robert Pagan and others. Alan's son Robert owns Finnert House. He married Augusta Buchanan in India. The son became Attorney General in Antigua and later a judge in Jamaica. As we cross over to Grey Place, I note the house of my cousin, Captain Sandy Allen. In 1800, when he was employed as a journeyman shoemaker near Galston in Ayrshire, Sandy moved to Saltcoats, intent on learning to be a ship's carpenter, but gave it up to go to sea. He was soon sailing as mate to Captain Wilson of Saltcoats. Within a few years, Captain Sandy Allen had served as master and part owner of several small ships trading out of Saltcoats. During the Peninsular War, the 175-ton brigantine Hero, with Captain Allen as master, was chartered by the government to transport troops and goods to the continent to supply Wellington's army. By 1814, Sandy Allen had established a reputation as an excellent mariner and shrewd businessman. A new ship was needed, and on the 5th of June 1819, the Jean sailed from Greenock for Quebec with Captain Sandy Allen as master. Within a few years, the name of the Allen family was synonymous with North Atlantic shipping. Mary McPhee lives here. She married John Graham, a shipmaster, who died 5 years ago. His son, Robert, the younger brother of John became seriously ill. It was suspected that he had tuberculosis, and therefore a month later he was sent to Jamaica to escape the Scots winter. On the 4th of March, Robert Graham died at Kingston. He had reached Jamaica safely the previous January, after a voyage lasting 45 days, but had not benefited in health, and after landing, as letters from Colin Campbell, James McPhee's partner, show, had failed rapidly. He was only 20 years of age, a very fine lad, and deservedly a universal favourite. Walking along West Quay Street, we head towards the West Burn again. Along the street here were the early industries of the town: noisy coopers' yards, smelly fish curers, and the stench of the dyeing works. They have now moved to the hills, and more houses have started to be built here. At the far end of West Quay Street is the house where my sister lives, built by my father back in the day. Up until 1817, the streets of Greenock were lit by oil, and domestic lighting was by seal or whale oil or candle. Civic affairs became increasingly the responsibility of the town council, and so it was decided in 1817 that the trustees of the water fund would take to do with public lighting. It wasn't until 1826 that plans were put into operation. A public subscription raised £9,100 to pay for the works, and the gas works were built at Crawford and Laird Streets, backing on to West Quay Street. The town was partially lit with gas for the first time on September the 1st, 1828, the cost of the works being £8,371.09. Thus the Greenock Advertiser on the great occasion wrote, "The novelty and brilliancy it displays have caused it to be no common source of attraction to all classes of the community. When contrasting the luminous effect of the Greenock gaslight with that of Glasgow, as well as some other places, there is a marked disparity in our favour." The cost of the scheme was repaid to the subscribers by 1831 and taken over by the Water Fund trustees. Mr. Ritchie was the manager and secretary of the gas undertaking. He might be a lame man physically, but he was not that mentally, and was a man both of grit and wecht. Old townsmen will remember his tussles with the gas trust, but his light was not easily put out. His staff was a small one, among whom was our future Chamberlain, Mr. McKellar. Electricity was unknown, and increased demand for gas led to the removal of the works to Ennisgreen, which was exchanged for the old gas tank in Delrmle Street. A bad swap for the Harbours Trust, which that time was a good mulch cow for the Corporation of Greenock. We now arrive at West Burn Street, the lower half nearer the river. Now there may be nothing of interest in this to the folks of the present day, except as showing the great change that has taken place about this burn and its boundaries. And this will be still further shown when I tell you that the West Burn was the great harbour and depot for all the herring fishing boats belonging to the West End curing establishments, and they were neither few nor small. When the fishing season was over, these boats, cooter boats they were commonly called, were all taken up the burn, and as many as could be accommodated in that piece of ground opposite H.W. Stewart's cooperage, and all down the street, were all hauled on shore, and mostly all turned bottom up. The burn was all open then, and the place where the boats lay sloped down to it. Bain's cooperage and offices occupied the whole of that extensive property at the north corner of Crawford and West Burn Street. The West Burn runs under where we now stand. It was covered up quite recently. At Delrmle Street there were pretty high parapets to the bridge that there spanned the burn, and the bridge itself was a great deal higher than the others further up at Crawford, Hamilton and Kilblain Street, so that the fishing boat might have a clear passage at high water. At low water the burn was almost dry. Immediately above the bridge at Crawford Street was a very busy spot of industry. On both sides of the burn there were steps leading down to the water, and here there was a broad long landing with checks to lay boards on. At these boards you would see a throng at work, Messrs. Houston's and Messrs. Patrick Dyer's men, also Messrs. Cowan's, Skinner's men, throng at work, rinsing cloth and washing fleece at all seasons in the clear water that they had diverted for a time for the above work. I have a feeling of dullness at the removal of these industries and old landmarks, for I often paddled in that burn, but know not where to look for a contemporary to whom it might be said, "We too, he paddled in that burn." We are now at the house that my father built and in which my sister lives. I have come to live with my sister as my health starts to deteriorate. My sight is not as good as it once was, but I often dictate my stories. I am currently writing my autobiography. To our right is the new Gaelic church. Prior to 1791, Reverend John Adam of the Mid-Kirk had an assistant named Blair, who began preaching on Sabbath evenings and at other times to Highlanders in the Gaelic in the Star Hotel, Broadclose. The Highlanders resident in Greenock in 1782 started to raise a fund for the building of a church for Gaelic services, and for some years prior to its completion in 1792 they were granted the use of the Mid-Kirk on Sunday evenings. The new Gaelic church in West Stewart Street is about to be opened and will be the fourth oldest in the town. Across the street, on Sugarhouse Lane, is the works of a group of well-known men: Robertson, Hunter, McPhee, Ritchie, McCunn, Ramsay and Wilson, with the German boiler Nicholas Witt in charge. Further down is the first sugar house in town, formed in 1765 and run by Mark Cool. I will now talk to you about my death. We regret to perceive that Mr. John Galt, author of Annals of the Parish, the Ayrshire Legatee, the Provost, and various other works of fiction, died at his residence in Greenock on Thursday, April the 9th. He had for some time been deprived of all power of locomotion by a series of paralytic attacks, no less than 11 or 12, of which he gives an affecting account in his autobiography. The Greenock Advertiser thus alludes to his physical helplessness and his death. To a person of his active habit, this want of exercise must have been very tiring, but the patience and even cheerfulness which he displayed during his protracted confinement was remarked by all who were privileged to visit him. The same disease which deprived him of his use of his limbs impaired the muscles of his hands, so that writing, so long to him a work of the greatest facility, became tedious and painful, and the cramped and distorted manuscripts which lately came from his pen, when compared with his former free-flowing handwriting, did not present a greater contrast than his shattered frame of late years did to his personal appearance 10 or a dozen years ago. It was astonishing to what an extent his mental powers retained their strength amid the decay of his physical energies. His memory, it is true, was so far impaired that latterly he required to finish any writing he attempted at one sitting, as he felt himself at a loss, on returning to the subject, to recall the train of his ideas. Yet his mind was as active and his imagination as lively as ever, and the glee which he either recounted or listened to any humorous anecdote showed that his keen sense of the ludicrous, so obvious in all of his novels, had lost none of its acuteness. On Tuesday fortnight he was visited by another paralytic shock, the 14th by which he had been assailed. This deprived him of the use of his speech for several days, although he afterwards had power indistinctly to articulate broken sentences. He was, however, quite sensible, and indicated by unequivocal signs that he understood what was said to him. He was aware that his end was approaching, and appeared calm and resigned. Indeed, before the last shock, he was perfectly conscious of the decay of his physical powers, and expressed on more than one occasion his belief that his death was at no great distance, and seemed to look to it not as an unwelcome release from a state of suffering. Back in the land of the living. We moved down to Delrmle Street, which is one of the main thoroughfares in town, home to a very wide variety of people and businesses. We are a short distance from the harbour and the shipyard of John Galt. The Scots set up their shipyard in 1711 and have been building ships since that time. They have close family connections with the West Indies, and they have moved from building boats for the local fishing industry to West Indiamen for the colonies. They bring their timber in from St. Lawrence's in Canada and employ a great many men in the town. All around this area are the stores of the merchants, as well as cooperages, chainworks, and all the ancillary businesses. The street called the Vinnell runs down to Delrmle Street. It is a buzzing centre of inns, taverns, whisky shops, lodging houses and industry. Running parallel is Charles Street, where Mary Campbell, the poet born Zamur, died in 1786. He wrote the lines, "Thou lingering star with lessening ray, that lovest to greet the early morn, again thou usherest in the day, my Mary from my soul was torn. O Mary, dear departed shade, where is thy place of blissful rest? Seest thou thy lover lowly laid? Hearest thou the groans that rend his breast?" Having crossed Delrmle Street, we now stand on the grounds of the old West Kirk. The founding of the old West Kirk takes us back to the time when Scotland had her own king and court, and when Elizabeth reigned in England. Only 2 years before, the unhappy Mary, Queen of Scots, had been released from her long captivity by the tragedy of Fotheringay, and only 1 year had elapsed since the Protestant parties in both kingdoms alike rejoiced at the disaster to the Spanish Armada. In 1591 all was ready, and on the 4th of October the church was opened. Mr. Andra Murdo, an M.A. of St. Andrews, was appointed the first minister. Its cost was 3,000 merks Scots, or £166, 133 shillings and 4 sterling. The following year, Parliament passed an Act approving of the Kirk of Bigot by John Shaw of Greenock. And it is interesting coincidence that on the same day was also passed the well-known Act which has been called the Great Charter of the Church of Scotland. This Act provides for the administration of the Kirk by General Assemblies, Presbyteries and Kirk Sessions, as we have them at the present time. The Old Kirk was therefore not only founded by Royal Charter, but was thus the first Presbyterian church confirmed by the National Parliament. And so we return to where we started, at the West Harbour. Let me return to the subject of the infamous press gangs. Dr. Colquhoun, whom we met earlier, was the official medical inspector at Greenock of those unfortunate seamen and others who happened to be captured by the press gangs of that day for service in the Royal Navy, and he had more than once threatened, when he considered MacTaggart to be refractory, that he would have put him on board a man-of-war. This he could easily have accomplished, for Tagg was now a sturdy youth in his 18th year, and the notorious Lieutenant Benny, commanding HMS Tender, Rose and Elizabeth, called at the doctor's house every Thursday in order to take him on board the vessel, which lay in the stream opposite the Westburn. Press gang was a terrible word, especially in a sailor's ear. Composed of the most brutal ruffians who could be got together and commanded by leaders less savage and merciless, humane and honourable authors shrank with disgust from, and if possible avoided, such despicable employment. Press gangs kidnapped not only merchant seamen but craftsmen and others, often in gross and wicked excess of their authority. MacTaggart said many years later, "I have known many instances of sailors in the merchant service newly home from a voyage being captured and sent on board a man-of-war without even the privilege of seeing their wives and families, from whom they had been long separated. And from another writer we learn how a newly returned sailor was torn from the arms of his shrieking wife and family in the dead of night, and he, if he offered the slightest resistance, half murdered, or even, as it sometimes happened, killed outright. These things took place daily for years in and around all our large seaport towns, and raids were made from time to time to sweep the smaller ports and coasting towns. Before we finish, let me tell you a few tales of Greenock. The following circumstance occurred in the year 1813. I happened one day to go down the quay, when I saw a great crowd of persons assembled at the corner of the harbour, west of where the custom house was afterwards built. It was low water at the time, and I observed two lads, having the appearance of apprentice seamen, standing up to the waist in water, having hold of a woman who was also in the water, and whose head they were attempting to put under, with the evident intention of drowning her. At the same time I observed also in the water a young gentleman whom I knew to be Mr. William Findlater, a clerk in a counting house in town, doing his best to protect the woman. He went on to run a very successful whisky business in Ireland. I did not hear any words uttered by the persons in the water. As I could not bear the sight, I resolved to endeavour to rescue the woman. I learned that the offence was that she had been given information to the press gang against some sailors. A war with France was then raging, and every effort was being made by the government to procure men for the navy. The vulgar supposed that certain persons gave information where sailors were to be found, and that the press gang somehow or other got hold of these men more readily than those of whom they had no information. I am not aware that this was the case, for I do not remember hearing anything said of the gang having gone to houses to pick up men. They used to prowl about the quays and shipping to catch men, and I have seen them myself do so. But that as it may, the name of informer was odious, and it was supposed that every insult might be offered to such as bore the character, and that even life might be forfeited, as seemed likely to be the case in the instance I am now detailing. I have said that I resolved to endeavour to extricate the woman from her very dangerous position. A stair at that time led down to the water, but as the parties were at some distance from the stair, I did not think it prudent to go into the water. Luckily, or should I rather say, as a special providence directed, I observed a boat belonging to Alan McLean, pilot, coming into the West Harbour, with McLean on board. The boat came alongside a vessel at the quay, not far from the spot where the people in the water were. I leaped directly into McLean's boat and desired him to push her over to where the woman was, but he at first peremptorily refused to do so, fearing no doubt that he would participate in the odium attached to the name of the informer if he gave any assistance. He afterwards yielded and came ashore, saying he would hold me responsible for the safety of the boat. I took an oar and pushed the boat over without any resistance from McLean. On reaching Mr. Findlater, I gave him my hand and he got into the boat. Before I had this done, the young sailors had got the woman out of Mr. Findlater's hand and put her into another boat, into which they themselves also went, and proceeded out of the harbour. We followed in our boat. At the harbour mouth, as the wind drove the boat out into the river, the young men used all their force, trying to throw the woman into the sea. Mr. Findlater and I got our boat alongside of the other, on which one of the younger men lifted an oar and aimed a blow at me with it. But I warded it off with the oar I held, and then stretched out my hand and called to the woman to give me hers. She was lying in the bottom of the boat with her hands grasping the gunwale and her feet firmly pressed against the opposite side. One of the young men was in the act of beating her fingers with a thole pin to make her let go, when our boat got alongside. He had a few more minutes or perhaps seconds elapsed before we reached her, She would have, without mercy, have been thrown into the sea, and a foul murder would have been committed in presence of hundreds of men, women and children who stood on the quay, idle spectators of what was going on. When I held out my hand, the woman eagerly grasped it, and I drew her into our boat. I then addressed myself to a number of persons who were standing on the end of the West Quay, and implored them to assist me in landing the woman, and protecting her from further violence. I knew some of the persons I addressed, particularly one of the shipmasters, but he would not interfere, and my appeal was answered by a volley of stones from the crowd. We let our boat drift out of reach of the stones into the river, and proposed to row down to Mr. Scott's building yard, and there put the woman on shore. On getting abreast of the yard, the carpenters were all assembled, it being dinner hour, and I made an appeal to them, but they would not allow the woman to land. There appeared therefore no alternative but to row alongside the press tender, then lying at the tail of the bank, which we did, put the woman on board and left her there. Mr. Findlater and I returned to the harbour with the boat. Had the police of the day done their duty, a scene so disgraceful could not have been witnessed. I had the principal actors apprehended and imprisoned, but so little account was made of the offence that no conviction followed. One of the young men apprehended was under indenture to a tradesman in town, Mr. Reed, hardware merchant, a decent, sober, religious man, who was his cautioner, appealed to the magistrates, who ordered his liberation to prevent his forfeiting the penalty in the indenture. Such was the state of the police of the town, and such the state of public feeling, that persons who had attempted a deliberate murder were allowed to escape without any trial or punishment. There was no sheriff in the place then, nor for 2 years afterwards, and there were only 2 or 3 police officers. I remember shortly before that seeing a man who was said to be an informer driven about the streets, all besmeared with mud and blood, and then thrown down and abused, and no one dared to interfere to rescue him from the band of miscreants who were following him. And so to the end. Here is one letter concerning my father. I have a copy of a letter from Captain Gibson of the Robust to my father, dated 30 leagues north of Lisbon on the 4th of April 1804. I am sorry to acquaint you of our melancholy misfortune, which happened on the morning of the 2nd. At 4 o'clock we struck the ground, and drove on shore, and about 30 or 1 and 30 more of the fleet, and the Apollo, our Commodore. A great many lives were lost out of the several ships, and the sight is dismal to behold for many miles along the shore. All our crew got on shore without the loss of a man. The Robust is altogether and fast, but the water ebbs and flows in the hold, and the surf is so heavy, it renders it impossible for any person to get now near to her. I do not think anything belonging to her will be saved, as she will break up in a very short time, and don't expect her to hold fast until tomorrow morning. The accident was merely through neglect of the Commodore. As the wind was from the south-west, there was no occasion to stand far to the eastward. All the fleet was sensible of being to the east, and some of them tacked, when he fired at them to bring them to. But he himself has suffered, with about 200 of his crew, some of whom were on the wreck these 60 hours without any subsistence. The Clyde ships which have suffered here are the Elizabeth owned by Galt, the Peggy, Carnochan, the Peggy by Barclay, Active, Mr. McNichol, Fame by Gamble, Albion, McEwing, Nancy, Weir, Caledonia, Gilkison, and the Trim, Oddy, and ourselves had much ado to get on shore, as no boat was able to stand the surf. There was a great deal of people lost out of the rest of the Clyde ships, some of them upwards of half their crews. There is a British consul here at present, who came from a town about 8 miles off called Figueiro. I have nothing more to mention at the present time, but I will write to you when I get clear of this, which I think will not be for some weeks. as we are to wait here, order of the consul, until we all get away together in a vessel to Lisbon. I hope you have enjoyed our stroll along the town of Greenock, introducing the many people who make this town the town it is, its merchants and its businessmen. I hope you have enjoyed this stroll around the town of Greenock, meeting the merchants and businessmen and learning how we depend on the trade with North America and the West Indies. The question of the abolition of slavery is one that is on the minds of everyone here, and how it will affect our future. It is not a simple black or white matter, but I fear that the appeal to our sentiment and sense of justice will somehow blind us to the practical future of the very people we are trying to liberate.